Learn to manage without my funds. The phrase struck like a stinging blow, abrupt and conclusive. I observed as Callan squeezed the scissors shut, severing the plastic with a glee I'd never witnessed in him before. My credit card, my essential link to food supplies, to minor luxuries, to the few remnants of autonomy I still clutched, now lay in tatters on the table. The fragments dispersed across the wooden floor. For an instant, quiet enveloped the space. I lowered myself gradually, my joints rigid from years, and gathered them individually. I refrained from debating. I avoided yelling. I merely uttered, "You're correct," Callan grinned, cocking his head as if he'd triumphed in some contest. He reclined in his seat, limbs folded, assured that he'd reaffirmed my subordinate role. I gazed at him, at the lavish timepiece on his arm, the pristine shirt. I knew he hadn't pressed himself, and I sensed something within me solidify. This was my offspring, the child I once transported to the bookstore every weekend, who used to grasp my palm when thunderstorms terrified him. Now he regarded me as if I were merely another expense to settle. I slid the fragmented bits into my pocket, clutching them like proof. My soul ached, not solely from the degradation, but from the awareness that my own progeny viewed me as an encumbrance. Decades of relinquishment, extended work hours, foregone meals, pre-owned garments, all so he could possess brand new items, surged through my thoughts. And this residence, the one he asserted I was merely residing in, had also been acquired with the proceeds from disposing of my personal dwelling. Yet here I stood, handled as though I'd added nothing of value. "You're correct," I murmured once more. But this occasion the phrase carried an altered flavor, not capitulation, but determination, because I recognized the reality he'd overlooked. I had constructed this existence fragment by fragment, and I still possessed greater influence than he ever envisioned. And shortly he would discover precisely how extensive it was. After Callan banged the door that evening, I remained solitary at the dining counter, the card remnant still embedded in my hand. My thoughts wandered rearward, years collapsing upon themselves like sheets I'd perused excessively. I was just 30 when his dad passed away. An unexpected seizure, no forewarning, no opportunity to ready myself. One moment I was a spouse, the next a bereaved with a 6-year-old lad gazing at me, posing inquiries I couldn't respond to. There was no alternative but to persist. I accepted every additional duty available at the archive, classifying until my vision fogged. On-off days, I instructed secondary students in language structure, amassing barely sufficient to meet Callan's expanding requirements. I mastered extending a currency note until it almost ripped. Supper consisted of grains and legumes more evenings than I wish to recall. Getaways were tales and volumes, not journeys we could finance. I vending the tiny gem necklace my mom bequeathed to fund his orthodontic work. Subsequently, when university approached, I disposed of the vehicle I cherished, an aged coup that scarcely operated, but it belonged to me. Helen required fees more than I needed transportation. I trudged to employment in downpours, holding a parasol that warped in the breeze, assuring myself it justified it. Each forfeiture, each pain, each callus on my soles was for his benefit. And Callan flourished. He never noticed the anxiety creases carved into my countenance as I equilibrated invoices deep into the night. He solely perceived the prepared midday meals, the spotless attire, and the study materials awaiting on his workspace. He matured, convinced achievement was something he attained solo. But the actuality varied. His accomplishments had been financed with my insomniac evenings, with adornment containers vacated and financial reserves depleted. Now, as I occupied his dwelling decades afterward, regarded like a reliant, I pondered how imperceptible those eras had grown to him. The burden of relinquishment still compressed against my torso heavier than before, and I realized I could no longer bear it unspoken. It was the moment for him to perceive the expense he'd disregarded. Callan enjoyed portraying the dedicated offspring. In kin assemblies, he would stand erect, his limb nonchalantly placed around my upper arm, and declare I support mother. She'd be adrift without me. The statements would elicit approvals of esteem, a few whispers about what an exemplary fellow he was, and I would grin courteously, suppressing the fact that scorched at the rear of my larynx. Behind secured entrances, the narrative altered. He scrutinized my food invoices, encircling products he considered superfluous. A container of syrup, a pouch of Java grains, a modest floral arrangement I had selected because the cooking area seemed less isolated with Hugh on the counter. "You're fortunate. I don't terminat," Sathini. "You for this folly," he'd grumble, brandishing the documents like testimony in a hearing. Even though I funded everything with my personal currency, he instructed me I ought to be appreciative. Appreciative for the shelter, for the services, for the fragments of self-respect he permitted me. Yet, when his individual charge summaries arrived, I observed the figure's expenses from premium lounges, novel devices shipped to the entrance, footwear that exceeded my monthly provisions in cost. He never challenged his extravagances, only mine. I restrained my words, accumulating the affronts, observing the haughtiness expand in him like an eclipse that engulfed every nook of benevolence I recalled. He had persuaded himself that he was the sustainer, the rescuer, the one who bore me. In truth, he was oblivious to the fact. The existence he displayed was erected on forfeitures he never recognized. Each instance I remained mute. I questioned if I was instructing him that this conduct was tolerable. My muteness evolved into a barrier, but also a confinement. And as his vaunts intensified, so did the throb within me. I started to perceive distinctly that haughtiness wasn't merely obscuring his discernment. It had already robbed his esteem, and if I persisted voicing nothing, it would deprive me of mine too. That evening, as he displayed a fresh chronometer acquired without delay, I comprehended the hour had arrived to safeguard my personal merit before he expended that as well. Callan never inquired about my finances because he presumed there was nothing to query. In his view, I was a pensioned educator surviving on remnants, reliant on his kindness. He had no clue that post-retirement, while he was occupied flaunting his advancements, I had been silently assembling something of my own. It commenced modestly in a ledger I initiated at an alternate institution, one he was unaware of. Each cycle I stashed portion of my annuity, occasionally just a few hundred, occasionally greater. I declined to allow him to view the reports in sede. He believed I expended every penny on edibles and spiritual contributions, and I permitted him to think it. But I didn't merely accumulate. I educated myself. I perused about securities, collective investments, and elevated return ledgers. At night, when the abode was hushed, I examined rate charts and yield forecasts the manner I once evaluated compositions. Gradually, the figures increased. What initiated as a prudent buffer evolved into something vastly superior. Now distributed across ledgers, my accumulations amounted to over $240,000. Humble relative to wealth and publications. But for me, it signified liberty. It signified I would never genuinely require Callan. It signified the decision to depart was perpetually mine, even if he hadn't grasped it yet. And then there was the cabin, a battered small dwelling by the town's perimeter, compensated entirely years prior, registered in my title solely. I'd maintained it confidential, repairing it incrementally with funds Callan believed had evaporated into obligations. He never knew it was there because he never conceived I could retain anything without him. Every invoice, every ledger report, every title was stored in orderly dossiers in the secured compartment of my workspace. I preserved them like an instructor preserves curriculum outlines systematic, comprehensive, prepared to demonstrate a lesson when the occasion arose, and I recognized that instant was approaching. The haughtiness in Callan's tone, the privilege in his gaze, it was merely a question of duration before I would need to reveal to him what he had elected to ignore. It was intended to be minor, a straightforward gown for the spiritual collection event. I hadn't acquired anything fresh in ages, and when I discovered it discounted, I considered it an innocuous treat. But when Callan spotted the invoice on the surface, he raised it like a ruling. $180. Are you insane, mother? His tone echoed through the dwelling, piercing and laden with disdain, This is careless. You can't simply squander currency like this. I remained motionless, viewing him flourish the document. Callan, it's not some opulence. It's for one night, a notable occasion. And moreover, do you recall that Lynx excursion you embarked on last cycle that amounted to 3,000? That's dissimilar, he retorted. Lynx's connections. It's for my profession. Your gown is merely conceit. I sensed the phrases immersed like boulders, weighty and unjust. For years I had abstained so he could possess all athletics, university, voyages overseas. And now, when I ultimately permitted myself one humble acquisition, he presumed to label me extravagant. The duplicity was intolerable. I could hear the resonance of my personal strides on damp pavements, transporting supplies after vending my vehicle. And I could visualize the empty container where my adornments had once been exchanged for his education costs. Every forfeiture returned to me in at instant keener than his tone. Without further utterance, Callan proceeded to his workspace, seized the shears, and came back. I anticipated what was impending, but I didn't shift. He elevated my charge card aloft like a prize and bisected it, the material splintering under the edges. The segments drifted to the ground. There, he declared with conclusiveness. No further imprudent expenditures, master existing without my funds. I stooped, collected the debris, and rose. But I didn't weep. Something within me altered instead. My endurance extended slender for excessively long, solidified into purpose, because if Callan believed this was the conclusion of my self-reliance, he had no notion what tempest was already assembling in quietude. The dwelling was muted except for the subtle groan of the steps as Callan advanced toward his chamber. By the time his entrance latched, I was already positioned at my compact workspace in the quarters he'd allocated me. The segments of my severed card arranged like shards of a fractured vow. I gazed at them for an extended period, then extended for the communicator. The initial contact was to the financial establishment. My tone didn't quiver as I validated my particulars and requested the agent to terminate the shared ledger. I asked for half the equilibrium, my legitimate portion, moved to a ledger in my title exclusively. The subsequent contact was to a long-time acquaintance, Evelyn, an attorney who had once occupied adjacent to me on archive committees and afterward assisted me compose my testament. She responded drowsy but cordial. And when I detailed what had transpired, her manner intensified. Dispatch me the paperwork tomorrow. Asset titles, pension ledgers, anything you desire protected. We'll ensure it's all impenetrable. After we disconnected, I withdrew the secured compartment where I'd maintained everything methodical. Dossiers marked invoices, fastened tidily titles inserted into safeguarding covers. Years of subdued perseverance displayed before me like a weaponry. I prepared a vessel of robust Java, the variety that saturates the atmosphere with both solace and purpose. Positioned at the petite counter by the pane, I imbibed gradually, allowing the warmth to stabilize me. I didn't experience dread anymore, only lucidity. Callan believed severing a card would confine me. What he didn't comprehend was that he had liberated me instead. He had compelled me to assert what had perpetually been mine. By the time the timer reached midnight, the financial movement was finished. My attorney was notified, and my subsequent actions were already shaping. Upstairs, Callan slumbered deeply, oblivious that his structure of deceptions was starting to incline. By the following midday, Callan departed the dwelling with his customary strut keys, clinking communicator in grasp. I lingered, creasing a tire at the counter, anticipating the upheaval I knew was impending. Afterward, I discovered precisely how it developed. He had entered an eatery near his workplace, requested a sub in Java, and glided his card with that negligent assurance he always bore. Rejected. The attendant requested he attempt anew. He chuckled it away, gliding the card once more. Rejected. This occasion, the queue behind him became agitated. Someone exhaled. Another murmured, The attendant's forehead creased as she reiterated the term like a hammer descending. Rejected. Callan's visage ignited crimson. He searched for another card, mumbling something about the device being defective, but the harm was inflicted. Gazes were upon him, viewing the gentleman who boasted about monetary dominance abruptly stumble. He rushed out, abandoning the sub intact. In the lot, he contacted the financial establishment. His tone, generally oozing with command, bore alarm. Now, this is Callan Rowan. My card's malfunctioning. What's occurring? The agent inspected the ledger. Sir, your shared ledger was terminated this dawn at 9:30 by the joint owner, Mrs. Marable Rowan. Resources were moved correspondingly. There was a halt lengthy enough for me to picture his inhalation halting. She can't perform that, he faltered. Stu faltered. Yes, sir. In shared ledgers, either participant has equivalent power to terminate or extract. The equilibrium was divided, and your segment stays reachable in your individual ledger. The phrases struck him fiercer than the murmurs in that eatery queue. The currency he believed was exclusively his had never been merely his. It was mutual, and now it was separated. He disconnected and motored home ashen and clenched mandible. I heard the entrance bang the hefty thump of his footwear across the surface. And when he summoned my name, his tone bore not victory, but the crude brink of incredulity. The entrance banged firmly enough to shake the structure, and Callan's tone pursued piercing and frenzied. Mother, what have you accomplished? I didn't glance upward immediately. I continued decreasing the cloth in my grasp, evening the borders until they aligned precisely before positioning it on the heap. Only then did I encounter his gaze. I performed precisely what you instructed me to perform. I stated uniformly. I mastered existing without your funds. His visage was reddened, his torso rising. You terminated the ledger. Do you have any concept what you've inflicted? I extracted my half. I responded, 87,000. Nothing additional. The hue emptied from his jowls. He hadn't anticipated me to know the precise amount. His lips parted, but no phrases emerged. I've observed you for years, Callan, feigning you sustain me while expending liberally on yourself. He attempted to utter, but his larynx functioned futilely, the conflict draining from him. Him, the gentleman who had derided me as reliant, now stood trapped by his personal falsehoods, and one further matter I inserted, permitting my tone solidify. You've presumed all this time that I don't comprehend currency, but I've been accumulating, too. Over 200,000 distributed across ledgers and placements. Autonomous of you, autonomous of anyone. The space became hushed except for the buzz of the drying machine. Callan's gaze shifted from my countenance to the creased cloths, as if the fact itself was too burdensome to contain. Solta. He descended into a seat, no haughtiness, remaining just astonishment. I positioned the final cloth on the mound and cleansed my palms. The quietude between us bore more substance than any dispute ever could. And I recognized the equilibrium in this dwelling had altered permanently. Callan occupied hunched at the cooking counter, his grasp clenching the border as if it might maintain him stable. I placed the creased cloths aside and withdrew a seat opposite him. For once, he didn't attempt to occupy the quietude with his customary bluster. He merely gazed at me, awaiting for me to ease to withdraw the manner I always had, but I didn't. This concludes now, I stated softly. From this day onward, I am not your reliant. I am your peer. His mandible firmed. Mother, you don't comprehend. I comprehend flawlessly. I interrupted. I comprehend that you constructed a narrative where you were the sustainer and I was the weight. But that narrative isn't accurate. I won't permit you to employ it anymore. The phrases appeared to excavate him. He assented gradually, his gaze fixed on the counter. All right, we'll proceed your method. But I detected the variance in his manner. This wasn't esteem. This was apprehension. The apprehension of being revealed to others, of forfeiting the persona he had erected. He wasn't concurring because he trusted in me. He was concurring because he had no alternative. I allowed the quietude to extend. I didn't debate. Didn't require more than his unwilling pledge. I had no desire in persuading him to appreciate me. I only needed to fortify my stance and safeguard what was mine. He assented anew, though his upper limbs drooped with bitterness he couldn't fully conceal. I collected my documents from the workspace compartment and inserted them into my carrier. He didn't query where I was heading, and I didn't provide a clarification because while Callan believed the issue was sealed, I was already gearing for the subsequent phase 1 that would liberate me from ever requiring his approval again. 3 days afterward, I loaded my belongings into 2 orderly valises and departed Callan's dwelling without formality. He didn't pursue me to the entrance, and I didn't request aid transporting my valises. By midday, I was turning the key to the entrance of my cabin, a location that had been mine for years, though I had maintained it discreet. The title carried only my name, evidence that some aspects of my existence had always pertained solely to me. The chambers emitted faintly of wood from the lining, an aroma that evoked the years I devoted quietly renovating the site. It wasn't magnificent, but it was complete, and it was mine. I placed my valises past a palm over the aged railing and experienced something I hadn't in an extended period, liberty without regret. That midday, I went to the financial establishment to initiate new ledgers. This occasion, there would be no mutual endorsements, no connections for Callan to manipulate. I designated my relative as inheritor, a youthful lady who had inquired about me more in a year than my offspring had in 5. It seemed appropriate. Callan visited once a few days subsequently. He positioned on the veranda upper limbs, drooping his tone gentler than I'd ever detected it. He didn't debate, didn't reprimand, didn't instruct. He only queried how I was adjusting, then departed swiftly, as though the burden of my self-reliance was heavier than he could endure. When he had left, I prepared a vessel of Java and transported a cup out to the veranda. I occupied with the periodical extended across my thighs, the light descending low past the foliage. The quietude surrounding me wasn't solitude, it was tranquility. Self-reliance had never been taken from me. It had always existed, awaiting, concealed beneath years of forfeiture and muteness. Now it was in complete solidity. I reflected on Callan's phrases, the ones he had hurled at me with such assurance. Master existing without my funds. I grinned into my Java.